Why are so cumbersome and how did we get here? We as recruiters, as business, we work so hard, right, to find exceptional talent and bring them into our organization. Yet, right when they walk in the door, we're diminishing the value, bogging them down with a burdensome handbook, right? It's a little counterintuitive, right? Handbooks can come across as defensive versus supportive. They can be read and seen as, protecting the company versus protecting the partnership between the employee and the employer. And also, a lot of times they have a connotation of being fear based. Hello, everyone. I'm Aviva. I'm the founder of Integral HR. And this LinkedIn series is What the Heck is HR Anyway? And it has us diving into the foundational and fundamental aspects of HR. So how did we get here? So the origin of HR and also just how the function came to be, right, was largely driven by being compliance and risk mitigating. Okay, so when you use that filter at that time when HR started, companies were asking the question, how do we keep the company out of the headlines? How do we ensure employees don't give the company a bad reputation because of their bad behavior? And how do we not get sued? Right. So if that being the three questions that we're asking, the default in how we were designing the handbook, aka policies and procedures for our company, were based off of risk averse as the primary driver. Okay. So a handbook, it's not uncommon to see it read as, if employee X does this, then here's the counteraction of how we're going to respond. Or, if you don't do this, we're going to dock pay. So kind of that quid pro quo, if you do this, I'll do that type of situation. Given this focus, that's how we came to have our employee handbooks being complex. And then, the company's interest being at the forefront of the policies and the procedures. And this also led to the narrative that still sticks today that HR, is basically the perception of HR is that they're just rule-based policies focused and they're just to protect the business. So, we want to simultaneously make a handbook more impactful, but also change the relationship that it has to HR. So, how do we go about shifting those? Because, handbook can be, is one piece, there's HR is another piece, and they don't equal gatekeeper between the business and the teams. Okay, so, here are a few facts about it, is that policies aren't bad, right? There are some instances where they're very practical. Top example I think about is driving on a road. In instances where people are following, practices and policies on the road, we all feel slightly safer. Okay, so they're not bad. Generally speaking, employee handbooks are not binding. Okay, unless it explicitly says so, right? So a lot of times, you're reading through and I don't want to say suggestions, but they're like how we show up as a company. Okay, so for example, I come to my mind like a personal bio on a website or on your resume, right? You're not committing and promising that in every instance, this is how you're going to show up, detail-oriented, thoughtful, and teamwork, right? It's just best self, this is how I talk about myself. And then in different instances, you might show up differently or the conversation would need to come into play. When a policy or something written in a handbook is written in a way that it's very specific and it can be interpreted as contractual. Okay, so it implies that, as you're reading this and as you're signing the handbook, that both of you are agreeing, employee, employer. So a good example here is paid time off, right? So, you're putting that in the policy, but it's contractual in the sense of the company's giving you paid time off, you're giving the company work and performance. Okay, so that's usually how, if you think about PTO policies, they're usually very specific. And then also, if something is legally binding or not legally binding, you usually find statements such as, this policy outlined is subject to change. Okay, because we all know that, companies move at a fast pace. Policies might not always keep up, especially if it's a handbook is flat. Rules and regulations change, so it's very common that you will find this is the policy, but also know that it's subject to change without notice because it moves so fast the handbook doesn't always keep up. Okay? How not to put together a handbook. Right, so I want to start with the don't, and then we can go into, the do's, and then just kind of the framework that I recommend us putting in place for, moving forward. So don't use policies, right, and practices within organization to deal with bad behavior of one individual. I have seen this happen. Rather what you want to do is have policies that support the many, not the few. Okay, so you don't want to do, bad behavior is an individual problem. It's not always a team problem. So you want to address bad behavior individually with one-on-one with that team, that manager. And then your policy should look big picture. Okay, so if one person doesn't listen to, and I'll continuously use paid time off because it's easy for us to, and we all resonate with it. If one person doesn't follow the policy, you don't change the whole policy and make it stricter or more detailed. You leave the policy if it's working overarchingly from 90% of your company, and you address the one-off situations individually. Okay? Second don't over-engineer a system and a procedure. Okay? So you don't want to build out a policy and go into, on Monday you do this, on Tuesday you do this, or 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, because ultimately what happens is it becomes a choke point. And then it slows the business down. Okay, so you don't want your policies and your practices to slow people down. You want to frame it where it's just the ease of use and understandable. And this is how we do things, so it keeps your business moving. Okay, third, final don't for here is that don't copy other handbooks, policies, and procedures from other companies. Okay, so it's good to use them as a framework. I would say sometimes there's standards for good policy, one being that they work, 2 different industries might have, but copy and pasting doesn't usually work because handbooks and policies, again, can be company specific, right? And they're based off of culture and what's important at that time to them, right? Handbooks we usually renew each year. Not always are there drastic changes, but they are built by a company, by a team for that company, for that team. Okay, I wanted to share some examples of how if you read a policy, it might showcase your culture, right? Just so we could bring through that clarity. For example, if one of your values are autonomy, right? So everyone gets to show up and do their own work. You want your language and your policies and your procedures to talk more and emphasize the output of the work more than on the hours spent, right? Because dictating hours is usually the opposite of autonomy, right? And especially if that's the value, you don't want your policies to contradict what you're saying is important to your company, okay? Second example, you want to make sure that your policies, if your culture is employee-employer relationship, then, for example, your notice period policy, so when people give notice of leaving, should be equal employee-employer. So if it states we will give you 2 weeks notice, then the employer should give 2 weeks notice back, right? And those are little subtleties where, people do really notice, is it equal, or is your handbook reverting back to, how handbook started, and it's all about the company and risk averse to them. So what's best for them, right? And then you want to make sure that what you do is consistent in there. And this final detail is, if you have policies, again, that are so specific, let's take an example about attire, what to wear to the office. So if you're like, what to wear to the office, it needs to be a button down, 3 buttons, X colors, shouldn't have rips, shouldn't have, if you're getting into that much detail. Or another example being remote work. So your remote work setup has to be at a stationary desk in the same place all of the time. Access to X amount of Wi-Fi, right? That amount of detail reads micromanagement, right? So if you're talking to an adult, they know that if they're taking a job that they have to show up and it says business attire, that they're showing up as business attire, right? And they're gonna understand the company they're joining, and they're gonna kind of meet their pro quo. Same thing with remote work, right? If you're hiring someone remotely and you have to tell them exactly what they need to do great work, you're probably not hiring an adult, and that would be where you would expect to see a micromanagement culture. Okay, so again, those are just 3 examples where, policy shows culture, culture dictates policy. Okay, so fast forwarding to, bringing us back to the future where we are right now, and my approach to handbooks is that they should be, right now is, coming and utilizing handbooks as how we handle these types of situations. Okay, so if you're coming into a company, as a new employee, you want to understand let's bring up PTO again because we're already running with it, how do they handle PTO? When do I get off? How would I get off? Are my sick days blend in with my personal days? You want to know how they handle these things, right? Because it's growing. It should be a baseboard for, hey, this is how we said we're going to handle it. We should expect it to do so. Okay. Second piece here, you want to make sure that it's clear language, right? It's like if there's jargon in there and if people are not sure what you're saying, if there are paragraphs and it's just like all legal, there's a lot of room for misinterpretation. And then the handbook misses the point because the whole point of the handbook is to bring clarity between the partnership of work. So don't use jargon and don't leave room for error or reinterpretation of something. Okay, questions are not the same as not being clear or not clarity. Yeah, those are just personal situations being addressed towards a handbook policy. Okay, more and more companies are multi-state. Okay, so there's federal law and then there's state laws where there are differentiation. I would probably say if you're already more than maybe 3 states that have drastic differences in some of the policies, we want to create a multi-state handbook just so that everyone, in each state is very clear on how each situation may arise or how they should expect to be addressed. Okay, because they start breaking down a little bit in there and get granular. So you don't want to just lump everyone into one. You just want to make sure that you're having centralized specific handbook policies for those that it matters to. Okay, any documents that are legally binding, okay, should be, and I'll give you an example, should be in the handbook, but they should also be pulled out of the handbook. Okay, so handbook usually tends to be, I don't know, try to keep them readable, maybe 20 pages, something like that. But they could, depending on the type of business you're in, they could be a little extensive. So you want to make sure that you're pulling out the legally binding documents where it's like, you're really going to pay attention to outside separately and have them get signed separately. So a great example is your non-disclosures. Okay. Those usually, you want to make sure that when people are entering the company and leaving the company, they paid attention to that because that's something legally binding. So those types of documents, non-disclosures, should come out and be a separate document as well. Okay. So let's kind of jump in as we wrap up here just around framework and how to approach building one, right? Because we've talked about how they started, right, and the people's outlook on them. We've talked about, facts about each one and like the importance of it. We talked about 3 things on how not to do and some examples also around, how to write a policy to meet a culture, right? So what you're trying to have the employees take away and how culture should align with your policies. And let's wrap up with just the template and the framework for them. Okay, so I like to tie it into your handbook should be why, how, and what. Okay, so you kind of break it into those 3 sections, and then I like to break them into 2 parts. Okay, so the first section being that why, and that's welcome to the company information. We got some of our policies and procedures. What you're going to have in there is also obviously code of business conduct, so what to expect, attendance, dress code. Following that by your whys, your legal and your federal state policies. Health and safety is an important one, and then paid leave and benefits. Okay, so that falls under the why. And then the policies would be the how, right? So the why is the company welcome. The how is all the policies and procedures. So how should I expect you to handle this? How do we go about this? How do I, access this being, let's say, paid leave? Okay, and that final piece, that what, and I always like to pull that out into like second part of the handbook is compensation. Okay, so compensation, how do we handle compensation conversations, evaluations and promotions, disciplinary actions and terminations, because those obviously reverted to frequently and then they come up often, and we want to make sure that we're being clear on how we approach those. And then the key point here, of course, is the consistency. So those are, the hows, the what's, and the whys of how to create an effective handbook. How we want to utilize them is in partnership with the business, really being an enhancement and understanding and a document to talk about our culture and our procedures as they start and as our business grows, right? What people can expect as they join, how we handle things, and what to do in the instance and why. So thank you for joining today on What the Heck is HR Anyway? Feel free if you have any questions about your handbook or looking to build, update, enhance, or make your handbook personal, feel free to reach out. We do that for companies and we have a lot of fun doing it. Talk to you guys soon. For now.